And Amos Kaburu, the Senior Programs Officer at Oweza East Africa, now joins us live from the City Center studios. Amos, with the release of results today, I mean, we have seen celebrations from parts of the country. The CS has said that this year marks an improvement in performance as compared to last year. As the experts in this particular sector of education, how do you assess the performance this year? Of course, I believe you haven't been able to go through it all, but let's take a look at the strategies that have been put in there before and after exams to now when the results have been released.
Thank you, Akisa. Pupils have performed better than last year. That was pretty much expected because there is one phenomenon that is quite evident, and that's a reality that Kenyans are hardworking. And it's just that we had to deal with this culture of impunity, that hard work was not being rewarded. Results were a factor of other things, including contamination coming out of access and leakages to exams. So the very fact that people are now aware that there are less loopholes in terms of exploiting to access exams ahead of time and less cases of cheating, teachers were bound to work hard, and we've seen it happen. And so expect that results are going to improve. Come next year, the results will even be better than what we've seen this year. So this was pretty much expected.
But let's take a look at even the exam ranking system. This was banned in 2014. We know that members of parliament reinstated it. But do you think that this has helped since 2014 to now in terms of performance for students in, say, primary schools?
I don't think that ranking has got an effect because what Parliament passed was a motion, but it still took the responsibility to the Cabinet Secretary to come up with a mechanism through which they would rank schools or perhaps to show performance. And this was occasioned by previous cases whereby there is a lot that is supposed actually to happen around examinations. Actually, one of the things that we've forgotten is that national examinations don't just serve the purpose of placing children for secondary school, but national examinations provide critical feedback in terms of assessing the effectiveness as well as the efficiency of an education system. For instance, there are factors such as completion rates. There are issues around gender parity. There are issues to do with access, the issues to do with resource distribution and allocation across the country, because this is a country of diverse nature in terms of resource allocation towards education. And so national examinations are supposed to serve a bigger purpose rather than just the individual resource that children have that will facilitate them in terms of accessing national exams. So I think that even when you look at the statement given by the CS will probably give an indication to some of these things. Like the first statement has got to do with gender parity, and we're almost there because 50.9% of the boys sat for the exam and 49.1% of the girls. But however, there are other questions whether indeed we are achieving this gender parity, which is to be the relationship between the number of children who are sitting for examinations vis-a-vis those who are already enrolled in school. There's something to do with 27 counties that have recorded more girls than boys compared to the other 21 counties. This speaks to the greater issue of inequality, and which has got to deal with the first indicator that we deal with in education, which is access and equity. Whether indeed the opportunities in education are reaching all the children who are aged between 6 to 13 years, which is our acceptable primary school age, what we call the gross enrollment rate. So national examinations, much as some of us who are really opposed to them, we've to begin looking at them that they have got a broader mandate other than just reporting on the individual scores that the children have got. And I think that the Cabinet Secretary still owes it to implement the recommendation of Parliament to be able to come up with all these rank of all these different indicators so that we're able to tell that in terms of access, these are the number of counties that have reached there. There is something that the Minister of Education started this year, which is quite commendable, and that is to give every child a personal identification number, which is a PIN number, for us to be able to account for every child in the system. We're just talking about 993,000 sat for the exams. But if we look at this as a cohort, children who are sitting for the exam in the year 2017. Which year did they join primary school? 2009. Can we account for every child who joined school in 2009 so that we can tell that of these numbers, how many of them have sat for this examination? And that one gives us an indicator that we call wastage rate, or whether indeed we were able to retain the children who entered class 1 up to the time when they were leaving. So these results are supposed to give us some of these answers. So away from the celebration of the children who've scored very well, we congratulate them. These are some of the critical aspects and issues that we need to be interrogating within our system of education, particularly at this time when we are trying to reform the system so that this could inform some of the changes that we are having in the new envisaged curriculum.
Mm-hmm. But from previous research from even Twaweza East Africa, the turnover from primary school to secondary school, the numbers haven't been very good. I just want us to briefly talk about that, the turnover number from students from primary school heading to secondary school. Do you foresee that the number will be bigger this year? And even with that, how about the quality of education that students or children are receiving in primary schools?
Thank you. Akisa, you have actually asked me 2 questions. Let me also respond to them in the order in which you asked. The first question has got to do with the transition from primary school to secondary school. And actually, by the time the Jubilee government was coming to power in 2013, transition from primary school to secondary school is just slightly above 50%. And what the government has done is quite commendable because now transition rate are almost 78%. That one we're saying that of all the children who have sat for the exam, close to 8 out of every 10 will be able to join secondary school. Now, it's important to put this into context that transition is going to increase, partly because the government is going to provide free secondary education. Now, this one is purely going to be day, and there are preparatory phases around it. There's been an allocation of 6 billion that is supposed to aid improving transition to secondary school, because transition is not just about having access and having a number. I mean, it's not just about the performance. It has got everything to do with the available spaces. And we've always had a problem in the sense that if you're having, like this year we have 1 million children short of 7,000. How many classes do you require for these children to use in the secondary school? We only have about 8,000 secondary schools in Kenya, against close to 30,000 primary schools in Kenya. So you realize that this looks like a funnel shaped, that there are so many primary schools, but there are very few secondary schools. That's one of the factors that has been able to attribute to the lower numbers of transition. Now, the question of quality is something else altogether. Now, we have a challenge in the sense that what indicators do we use to measure the quality of education? Unfortunately, we only have this summative evaluation, and summative are exams that come at the end of the cycle, which is KCPE and KCSE, which have been the most critical indicator of measuring the quality of education. So we require what you call ongoing forms of indicators or assessments or examinations that will be able to tell us whether indeed the system is behaving as it's supposed to behave or not. But we've had this one being done on very, very little scale. Number two, we also don't have sufficient capacity and sufficient support mechanisms, including even the moral environment through which we'll be able to provide formative assessment. Whether indeed you will believe results given by a teacher that a class 3 child is performing well, for you to believe that you can rely on this information to tell whether the system is performing well or not. So these are two broad issues that have to be looked at, and they require a lot of input, they require a lot of support, and the proposed curriculum actually makes an attempt to try and address some of these issues. So one, transition is going to increase from next year if the Jubilee government is very keen to implement what it's planning to implement. But it's still not the panacea to the problem, because it's not just the question of availability of spaces. Yes, the government plans to absorb all the children, but there are also still what we call what households spend on education, issues to do with the uniforms, issues to do with food, issues to do with health. So is the government going to take over a uniform? Definitely the government will not. What about healthcare? The government is not going to provide it. What about transport to school? The government is not going to provide. So assume that you have the spaces for the 9,200 children who've got 400 marks who are supposed to go to national schools. Are all of them going to access the national schools? Definitely all of them are not going to access for simple reasons. The children who come from poor families may have a lot of problems to access. So it goes back to us relooking at the issue of affirmative action, that if we are committed that every child who scores 400 marks should be able to go to a national school, then we need to provide sufficient mechanism, whether it means a bursary system that will be able to facilitate them. I can assure you that come next year, more children will actually score over 400 marks. So the question of spaces available, the question of poverty around the population in Kenya are still factors that hinder transition from primary to secondary school.
All right, I want us to get back to that conversation when where you're talking about the capacity. Yes, we have made the day secondary school free, of course, for the public schools, and there's already worry that so many students will throng schools, but do we have the capacity to accommodate all of them? But let's